St. Louis, Missouri, 1908. Winter had descended early that year, bringing with it a persistent chill that seeped through the cracks of even the most well-maintained homes. The Mendoza residence, a stately Victorian on Lafayette Square, stood as a testament to Francisco Mendoza's success since immigrating from Spain 15 years prior. His import business had flourished, allowing him to provide his growing family with luxuries most immigrants could only dream of. Maria Mendoza sat in the nursery, gently rocking their newborn son, Alejandro, their fourth boy in 8 years. The christening was scheduled for tomorrow at the Cathedral Basilica, and despite what should have been a joyous occasion, Maria couldn't shake the dread that had settled in her chest. "You mustn't think of it," Francisco said from the doorway, his voice low. "The other times, they were coincidences, nothing more." Maria's eyes, ringed with dark circles, met her husband's. 3 sons christened, Francisco. 3 deaths on the same nights. This is no coincidence. Their first son, Miguel, had been christened in 1900. That night, their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, had passed away in her sleep, a sad event, but at 84, not entirely unexpected. 2 years later, their second son, Gabriel, received the sacrament. That evening, Francisco's business partner, Thomas Holcomb, was found dead in his study, a glass of whiskey spilled beside him. The doctor ruled it heart failure. And just 3 years ago, when their third son, Raphael, was christened, Maria's cousin Lucia, who was staying with them at the time, never woke up the next morning. "I won't do it," Maria whispered. "We can't christen Alejandro. Not tomorrow, not ever." "Maria!" Francisco crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "We are Catholics. Our son must be christened. I've spoken with Father Donnelly. He agrees these are merely unfortunate coincidences." A knock at the front door echoed through the house. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, answered it, and moments later appeared at the nursery door. "Mr. Mendoza, Dr. Wagner is here to see you." Dr. Wagner had been the family physician since their arrival in St. Louis. He was a pragmatic German immigrant who had little patience for superstition but great affection for the Mendoza family. "I came as soon as I received your note," he said, removing his hat as he entered. His eyes fell on Maria, who clutched the baby tighter. "Mrs. Mendoza, you look unwell." "She's convinced herself of a curse, Doctor," Francisco explained, the strain evident in his voice. "That deaths follow our sons' christenings." Dr. Wagner nodded solemnly. "I've heard of such beliefs. In the old country we call it Todesschatten, death's shadow." He approached Maria, his demeanor softening. "May I examine the child?" As Maria reluctantly allowed the doctor to check Alejandro, a cold draught swept through the room, making the gas lamps flicker. From downstairs came the sound of the grandfather clock striking the hour, though it was not yet time. "Strange," Dr. Wagner murmured, more to himself than to the anxious parents. "What is it?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing about the child," he reassured her. "He's perfectly healthy. But I must ask, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Cold spots, objects moving?" Francisco frowned. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" Dr. Wagner returned the baby to Maria's arms. "I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, if that's your concern, but sometimes, when the mind is troubled, it can." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It can create patterns where none exist." As he spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop further. Alejandro, who had been sleeping peacefully, began to cry, a high, distressed wail that made Maria's blood run cold. "Tomorrow," Dr. Wagner said firmly, "I will attend the christening, and I will stay the night here to ease your fears." But as the doctor left, Maria couldn't help but notice how he glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something or someone following him down the hallway. The morning of Alejandro's christening dawned grey and threatening, with dense clouds hanging low over St. Louis. Maria had barely slept, starting at every creak and groan of the old house. Francisco had tried to comfort her, but his own unease was palpable, despite his insistence that they proceed with the ceremony. As the family dressed in their Sunday best, Their three older sons, Miguel, Gabriel, and Rafael, were uncharacteristically quiet, sensing the tension between their parents. "Mama," 8-year-old Miguel tugged at Maria's sleeve as she adjusted his tie. "Is someone going to die tonight?" Maria's hands froze. "Who told you such a thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel shrugged, his eyes serious beyond his years. "Rafael said after his christening, cousin Lucia went to heaven, and after Gabriel's, Mr. Holcomb did too." Maria knelt before her eldest son, taking his small hands in hers. "Nothing will happen tonight," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Dr. Wagner will be here, and Father Donnelly has blessed the house." The mention of the priest's blessing was true. Francisco had arranged it the previous afternoon, a concession to Maria's fears. Father Donnelly had walked through each room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers in Latin, though he had seemed skeptical of the necessity. The christening itself was a small affair, with only close family friends and a few business associates in attendance. Dr. Wagner stood near the back of the cathedral, his medical bag at his feet, watching the proceedings with scientific curiosity. As Father Donnelly anointed Alejandro with chrism, a thunderclap shook the stained glass windows, startling the congregation. The baby, however, remained eerily silent, his dark eyes fixed on something above the altar that no one else seemed to see. "In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti," Father Donnelly intoned, making the sign of the cross over Alejandro's forehead. Another peal of thunder, closer this time. Several of the women crossed themselves nervously. The remainder of the ceremony passed without incident, though the storm intensified, forcing the family to rush to their waiting carriages afterward, forgoing the customary photographs on the cathedral steps. "A storm is no omen," Francisco assured Maria as they rode home, the rain lashing against the carriage windows. "Spring in Missouri is always unpredictable." But Maria wasn't listening. She was watching the passing streets, noticing how pedestrians hurried along with heads bowed, not just against the rain, but as if avoiding the gaze of something unseen. Even the driver seemed eager to complete the journey, urging the horses to a pace just shy of dangerous on the wet cobblestones. Back at the house, Mrs. Patterson had prepared a modest reception. As the guests removed wet coats and hats, Maria noticed Dr. Wagner in quiet conversation with Father Donnelly near the parlor fireplace. The two men looked up as she approached, their discussions ceasing abruptly. "Mrs. Mendoza," Father Donnelly smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A beautiful ceremony, despite the weather." "What were you discussing?" Maria asked directly, too exhausted for social niceties. The men exchanged glances before Dr. Wagner answered. "I was asking Father about the history of your home. I understand it was built in the 1870s? 1873, Maria confirmed. What does that have to do with anything? Father Donnelly cleared his throat. The doctor was curious about previous occupants. It seems he's developed an interest in local history. Maria knew they were hiding something. Tell me the truth, please. Dr. Wagner sighed. I've been making inquiries, Mrs. Mendoza, about deaths following christenings. There have been incidents documented in medical journals, rare but not unheard of. What kind of incidents? Maria's heart raced. Cases where multiple deaths occurred in connection with certain rituals or celebrations, he explained carefully, often in homes with history. Our home has history, Maria pressed. Father Donnelly looked uncomfortable. The church keeps records. Before your family purchased this house, it belonged to the Wainwright family. They lost 3 children in infancy, all within these walls. The revelation sent a chill down Maria's spine. And you didn't think to tell us this when we bought the property? The church doesn't interfere in real estate transactions, Mrs. Mendoza, Father Donnelly said stiffly. Besides, infant mortality was common 30 years ago. It didn't seem relevant. As they spoke, little Raphael appeared at Maria's side, tugging at her dress. Mama, he whispered, his face pale. There's a lady upstairs. She's looking at Alejandro. "What lady, Raphael?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her throat. "Mrs. Patterson is here in the parlor." Raphael's brown eyes were wide. "She's wearing old clothes, and she's sad. She keeps touching Alejandro's face." Dr. Wagner knelt to the boy's level. "Did the lady say anything to you, Raphael?" The child nodded solemnly. "She said he looks like her Thomas." Father Donnelly's face drained of color. Thomas Wainwright was the name of the last child the previous family lost in this house. Francisco, who had joined them in time to hear Raphael's description, immediately strode toward the staircase. "This is nonsense. Someone is in my son's room, and I intend to find out who." The others followed quickly, with Dr. Wagner staying close to Maria, who clutched Raphael's hand tightly. As they ascended the stairs, the electric lights, a recent and expensive addition to the Mendoza home, flickered uncertainly. The nursery door was slightly ajar, though Mrs. Patterson had closed it firmly when she'd laid Alejandro down for his nap before the guests arrived. Francisco pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was cold, unnaturally so for May. With the window closed and the radiator hissing, Alejandro lay in his crib, awake but silent, his tiny fists waving in the air as if reaching for something. "There's no one here," Francisco declared, though his voice lacked conviction. He moved to the crib and lifted Alejandro, holding him protectively against his chest. Maria surveyed the room. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet something felt profoundly wrong. The rocking chair in the corner moved slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. "Do you smell that?" Dr. Wagner asked suddenly. They all paused, inhaling. A sweet, floral scent hung in the air. Lilacs, though none were in bloom yet in their garden. Elizabeth Wainwright was fond of lilac water, Father Donnelly said quietly. It was mentioned in her obituary. She died shortly after her son Thomas. Maria's legs threatened to give way beneath her. Dr. Wagner guided her to sit on the small settee near the window. "We need to leave this house," she said firmly. "Tonight. We can stay at the Palmer Hotel until we find somewhere else." Francisco shook his head. "We can't just abandon our home because of a scent and a child's imagination." "It's more than that," Dr. Wagner interjected. "I've been researching the pattern you described, Mr. Mendoza, the deaths following your son's christenings. I believe there may be a connection to this house." "What kind of connection?" Francisco demanded. "In the old country, there are stories of grief so profound it leaves an imprint," the doctor explained. "Elizabeth Wainwright lost 3 sons in this nursery. According to records I found, each died mysteriously in their sleep despite appearing healthy." Father Donnelly made the sign of the cross. "Dr. Wagner approached me last week with his concerns. I consulted the diocesan archives. The Wainwrights sought the church's help. They believed something was taking their children." "Taking them? What does that mean?" Maria clutched Raphael closer. "They never specified," Father Donnelly replied. "But after their 3rd son died, Elizabeth became convinced that a presence in the house was jealous of her happiness. She claimed it wanted her children because it had lost its own." A cold draught circled the room, causing the delicate lace curtains to billow inward despite the closed window. "I don't believe in ghosts," Francisco stated firmly, though he held Alejandro tighter. "This is America, 1908. We are rational people. I don't speak of ghosts," Dr. Wagner said carefully. "But grief, guilt, despair, these emotions can manifest in ways science is only beginning to understand." As they spoke, Miguel and Gabriel appeared in the doorway, their faces solemn. "There's a lady downstairs now," Miguel announced. "She's crying in the parlor, and none of the grown-ups can see her." Gabriel nodded in confirmation. "She says we need to leave her house." Francisco looked at his sons, his rational mind battling with the evidence before him. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows like desperate fingers seeking entrance. "The children should not stay here tonight," Dr. Wagner advised. "Whatever is happening, they seem more sensitive to it." My sister's home is just 3 blocks away, Maria suggested. The boys could stay with her. Francisco hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I'll take them there myself, but I'm coming back. If there is something in this house, I won't abandon you to face it alone. As Francisco ushered the 3 older boys to get their coats, Maria turned to Dr. Wagner. What about Alejandro? Should he leave too? The doctor looked troubled. I fear moving him might provoke whatever this is. The pattern suggests it's the christening that triggers the phenomenon, not merely the presence of a child. Then what do we do? Maria asked, desperation edging her voice. Father Donnelly stepped forward. We confront it. Elizabeth Wainwright sought the church's help once before. Perhaps it's time to finish what was started 30 years ago. By 7 that evening, the older Mendoza boys were safely installed at their Aunt Isabella's home. Francisco had returned to find Dr. Wagner, Father Donnelly, and Maria in the parlor, where they had been formulating a plan. The storm outside had reached its peak, with lightning illuminating the room, in brief harsh flashes and thunder rattling the windows in their frames. This is what we know, Dr. Wagner was saying as Francisco shed his wet coat. 3 deaths have followed 3 christenings. Each death occurred in this house during the night, and now, it seems, the presence is making itself known more directly. Have there been more sightings? Francisco asked, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. Maria nodded. While you were gone, Mrs. Patterson was changing Alejandro when she felt someone watching her. She turned and saw, in her words, a woman in mourning clothes standing by the door. When Mrs. Patterson blinked, she was gone. I've sent Mrs. Patterson home, Dr. Wagner added. She was quite distressed. Father Donnelly had opened his briefcase and removed several items. A crucifix, a small silver container of holy water, and a worn, leather-bound book. What I'm about to suggest goes beyond the usual practices of the church, he said gravely, but these are unusual circumstances. What do you propose? Francisco asked, taking a seat beside Maria on the settee. A form of blessing, or exorcism, if you will, the priest explained. Not of a person, but of this house, to release whatever grief or anger binds this presence to this place. Dr. Wagner looked uncomfortable. I should note that while I believe something unusual is occurring, I'm not entirely convinced of supernatural explanations. Grief can manifest in powerful psychological ways, affecting perception. With respect, Doctor, Father Donnelly interrupted, I've seen things in my 30 years as a priest that cannot be explained by science alone. Whether we call this a ghost or a manifestation of collective grief doesn't matter. What matters is addressing it before another death occurs. Maria reached for Francisco's hand. I believe Father Donnelly is right. Something wants our attention, perhaps even our help. Francisco sighed deeply. Very well. What do we need to do? We'll begin in the nursery, Father Donnelly said, rising to his feet. That seems to be the center of the activity. Dim, the small procession made its way upstairs, Father Donnelly leading with crucifix in hand, followed by Francisco carrying Alejandro, then Maria and Dr. Wagner bringing up the rear. The doctor had insisted on bringing his medical bag, though what use modern medicine might be against a spirit, no one could say. The nursery was freezing when they entered, their breath visible in the air despite the May evening. Alejandro, who had been calm in his father's arms, began to fuss as they crossed the threshold. Place him in his crib, Father Donnelly instructed. We need to address the presence directly. Francisco hesitated but complied, laying Alejandro gently in his crib. The moment he stepped back, the rocking chair in the corner began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing vigor, as if someone unseen was agitated. Elizabeth Wainwright, Father Donnelly spoke loudly, his voice steady. If you are present, we wish to speak with you. The rocking chair stopped abruptly. A music box on the dresser, a christening gift for Alejandro, began to play on its own, the tinkling melody of green sleeves filling the silent room. "She's here," Maria whispered, instinctively moving closer to the crib. Dr. Fagner, his scientific skepticism visibly shaken, reached into his bag and withdrew a small camera. "If there is truly a manifestation, we should document it," he explained, his voice not entirely steady. As he prepared the camera, the temperature dropped further. Frost began to form on the inside of the window panes, spreading in delicate patterns across the glass. "Elizabeth," Father Donnelly continued, "we understand your pain. The loss of a child is a wound that never truly heals. But the Mendoza family is not responsible for your suffering." A low moan seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound so filled with anguish that Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. "We believe you've been seeking justice," the priest went on, "that somehow in your grief you've connected the christenings of these boys with the deaths of your own sons." The electric light overhead flickered wildly, then went out completely, leaving only the dim glow of Father Donnelly's candle to illuminate the room. "But taking more lives won't return your children to you," he said firmly. "It will only create more grief, more lost souls." Suddenly the candle flame bent horizontally, as if in a strong wind, though the air was still. Dr. Wagner's camera clicked as he captured the phenomenon. "My Thomas!" a voice whispered, so faint it might have been imagination. "They took my Thomas," Maria gasped. "Who took him, Elizabeth? Who took your son?" The response came not in words, but in a sudden, violent rattling of the window. A picture fell from the wall, a family portrait of the Mendozas taken last Christmas, the glass shattering on the wooden floor. Father Donnelly opened his book, beginning to recite prayers in Latin. The room seemed to resist his words, the candle flame sputtering as if trying to extinguish itself. "Wait!" Dr. Wagner said suddenly. "She said, 'They took my Thomas.' Not that he died, but that he was taken. What if—" He didn't finish his thought. The nursery door slammed shut with such force that a hairline crack appeared in the wood. Alejandro began to cry in earnest now, his wails joining the cacophony of supernatural activity. Francisco rushed to the crib, lifting his son protectively. "Enough!" he shouted. "Or whatever you are, whatever happened to you, leave my family alone." A sudden silence fell. Even Alejandro quieted, staring wide-eyed over his father's shoulder. Following the baby's gaze, they all turned to see a figure taking shape in the corner, not solid, but not quite transparent either. A woman in Victorian mourning clothes, her face pale and drawn with grief, her eyes fixed on the child in Francisco's arms. The apparition of Elizabeth Wainwright hovered near the window, her form shifting and wavering like smoke caught in a draught. Her eyes, hollow with grief and something else, perhaps anger, never left Alejandro. Dr. Wagner's camera clicked again, his scientific mind still functioning despite his obvious terror. Father Donnelly had stopped his Latin prayers, instead watching the manifestation with a mixture of awe and professional interest. "Elizabeth," Maria said softly, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Please, tell us what happened to your son." The ghost's attention shifted to Maria, the temperature dropping further as she focused her gaze. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "They said he was sickly," the spectre whispered, her words carrying the static of old phonograph recordings. "But my Thomas was strong. All my boys were strong." "Who said this?" Francisco asked, still holding Alejandro protectively. "The doctor, Dr. Fleming." The name was spoken with such venom that the candle flame flickered violently. "He came after each christening, said it was to check on them. But after he left—" Her form became more agitated, wisps of ectoplasm swirling around her like a miniature storm. "After he left, they wouldn't wake. My precious boys wouldn't wake." Dr. Wagner stepped forward cautiously. "Elizabeth, are you suggesting Dr. Fleming harmed your children?" The ghost didn't answer directly. Instead, she drifted toward the crib, causing Francisco to back away. "He christened them," she continued, "then took them, one by one. said it was God's will, said some were not meant for this world. Father Donnelly's face had gone ashen. "Fleming," he muttered. "I know that name from the diocesan records. Robert Fleming was a physician who worked closely with St. Mary's Orphanage in the 1870s. What does an orphanage have to do with this?" Maria asked, not taking her eyes off the apparition. "There were rumors," the priest said hesitantly. "Nothing proven, but some said he selected children, healthy infants who could be placed with wealthy families, unable to conceive." The implication hung in the air, horrifying in its cruelty. "You think this doctor was stealing children?" Francisco's voice was incredulous. "Replacing them with, what, dead infants?" "It wasn't uncommon," Dr. Wagner said grimly, "especially when the parents were wealthy and the child was an heir. A dead child meant inheritance complications, questions, but a child who simply failed to thrive." Elizabeth's ghost seemed to grow stronger as the truth emerged, her form becoming more defined. "He took them," she repeated, "and when I tried to tell Edward, my husband, he wouldn't believe me. Said I was hysterical with grief. But a mother knows. A mother always knows." Maria approached the apparition, ignoring Francisco's warning hand on her arm. "Elizabeth, I believe you, and I'm so sorry for what was done to you and your children. But my sons are innocent. Alejandro is innocent. They all die after christening," Elizabeth said, her voice rising. "Just like my boys. It's the pattern. It's the only way to make someone see the truth. But the deaths in this house, our neighbor, my partner, Maria's cousin, they weren't infants," Francisco objected. "They were adults." "The pattern," Elizabeth insisted. "The sacrament, then death. Someone must see the pattern." Dr. Wagner cleared his throat. "I think I understand. Elizabeth isn't causing these deaths directly. She's creating a pattern that mimics what happened to her children, drawing attention to it in the only way she can." Father Donnelly nodded slowly. A spirit trapped by injustice, unable to rest until the truth is known. Maria felt a profound sadness overtake her fear. This was not a malevolent presence seeking to harm her family, but a mother destroyed by unimaginable loss, desperately trying to communicate the only way she could. "Elizabeth," she said gently, "we see the pattern now. We understand what was done to you. Dr. Fleming can't hurt any more children. But my boys," Elizabeth's form flickered, grief overwhelming her manifestation. "My Thomas, my James, my little Henry, where are they? Did they live? Did they know I searched for them?" None of them had an answer. The truth of what had happened to the Wainwright children was likely lost to history, buried with the secrets of a corrupt doctor and a system that allowed such atrocities. "We can try to find out," Francisco offered, his skepticism entirely gone now. "There must be records somewhere, adoption papers perhaps. And we can give you peace," Father Donnelly added. "Not just the ritual kind, but real peace. Justice, as much as is possible after all this time." Elizabeth's ghost seemed to consider this, her form stabilizing somewhat. "You would do this for my boys?" "Yes," Maria promised, "for your boys and for mine. So that no more deaths need to follow christenings in this house." For the first time, Elizabeth's expression softened, the anguish momentarily replaced by something like hope. "Then I will wait," she said, "but not forever. Find them. Find what became of my sons." With those words, her form began to dissipate, the temperature in the room gradually returning to normal. The electric lights flickered back to life, and Alejandro, still in his father's arms, cooed softly, reaching toward the space where Elizabeth had been. Dr. Wagner checked his pocket watch. "It's nearly midnight," he observed. "If the pattern holds, someone should have died by now." They all exchanged glances, the realization dawning that perhaps they had broken the cycle. That by acknowledging Elizabeth's pain and promising to seek justice for her family, they had interrupted the grim pattern that had followed the Mendoza christenings. "We should still leave this house," Maria said firmly, "at least until we know more." Francisco nodded, no longer arguing. "We'll go to the Palmer Hotel tonight, all of us. And tomorrow we begin searching for the truth about the Wainwright boys." As they prepared to leave, gathering what they would need for the night, Dr. Wagner approached the crib where Francisco had placed Alejandro to wrap him in a warm blanket. "It's remarkable," the doctor said quietly, "how the human spirit can endure such tragedy and still seek justice, even from beyond the grave." "It's not justice she wants," Maria corrected him, watching her youngest son. "It's acknowledgement, someone to witness her truth after decades of being dismissed and forgotten." Father Donnelly, who was extinguishing his candle, paused. "In my experience, that's often what the departed need most. Not vengeance, but validation." As they left the nursery, Maria cast one last glance back. For a moment, she thought she saw Elizabeth again, standing by the window, watching them with solemn eyes. But it was only a trick of the light, the curtains moving gently in the draught from the hallway. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being allowed to leave, that their departure was a reprieve, not an escape. Elizabeth Wainwright would be waiting for them to fulfill their promise, to uncover the fate of her stolen sons, to bring light to a decades-old injustice. And if they failed, Maria had no doubt the pattern would begin again. The Palmer Hotel provided a night of uneasy rest for the Mendoza family. Despite the luxurious surroundings, plush carpets, oak furniture, electric chandeliers that spoke of modern prosperity, none of them could fully shake the sense of being watched. Francisco arranged for a suite with connecting rooms, one for Maria and himself with a bassinet for Alejandro, and another for Dr. Wagner and Father Donnelly, who had both insisted on staying close. Morning brought no supernatural occurrences, but did deliver the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, its front page declaring, "Prominent physician Dr. Harold Westfield found dead." The article detailed how Dr. Westfield, age 73, had passed away peacefully in his sleep the previous night. "Westfield?" Dr. Wagner murmured, scanning the obituary. "He was Fleming's student, took over his practice in the 1880s after Fleming retired." Francisco and Maria exchanged troubled glances. Even in their temporary sanctuary, it seemed Elizabeth's influence reached them. The pattern continued, but had shifted, no longer targeting random individuals connected to the Mendozas, but someone potentially linked to the original crime against her children. "We need to work quickly," Father Donnelly said, folding the newspaper. "I've arranged to meet with the diocesan archivist this morning. The church kept detailed records of christenings, including physicians who attended." Dr. Wagner nodded. "And I'll visit the medical society. If Fleming was stealing children, he wouldn't have been working alone. There would have been midwives, nurses, perhaps other doctors involved." Francisco cleared his throat. "I have contacts at City Hall. Birth records, death certificates. They might reveal inconsistencies if we know what to look for." Maria, who had been silent, looking down at Alejandro sleeping peacefully in her arms, finally spoke. "And I will go to the Wainwright family plot at Bellefontaine Cemetery. Elizabeth deserves to know where her children are buried, even if they're not truly there." They separated after breakfast, each pursuing their assigned investigations. Maria, accompanied by Francisco's assistant Robert, who had been instructed to guard her and Alejandro without being told exactly why, took a carriage to the cemetery on the northern edge of the city. Bellefontaine was a city of the dead, with grand mausoleums and ornate headstones spreading across rolling hills. The cemetery office directed them to the Wainwright plot, a modest family area compared to some of the more ostentatious monuments. The Wainwright monument was a simple obelisk of granite, inscribed with the family name. Around it, smaller headstones marked individual graves. Edward Wainwright, 1841-1890, Elizabeth Wainwright, 1845-1883, and three heartbreakingly small markers for Thomas, 1872-1873, James, 1874-1875, and Henry Wainwright, 1876-1877. "She died young," Maria observed, kneeling before Elizabeth's headstone. "Only 38. The article said she took her own life, Robert replied uncomfortably. After her third son died, Mr. Edward had her committed to the asylum briefly, but she found a way. Maria felt a profound sadness as she placed the lilacs she had brought on Elizabeth's grave. She couldn't bear it anymore. The loss, the disbelief from those who should have protected her. As they stood in silent contemplation, an elderly groundskeeper approached, leaning heavily on a shovel. "You folks interested in the Wainwrights?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco. "Yes," Maria answered. "Did you know them?" The old man shook his head. "Before my time. But my father worked here back then. Used to tell stories about the burials." Maria's interest piqued. "What kind of stories?" "Strange ones." The groundskeeper glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Said Mr. Edward insisted on closed caskets for all his boys, wouldn't let nobody see them, not even at the wake. And the caskets, my father said they felt wrong, too light, like there wasn't much inside." A chill ran down Maria's spine that had nothing to do with the May breeze. "Empty caskets? That's what my father suspected, said he once asked Dr. Fleming about it. He attended all the burials, apparently. The doctor told him some diseases wasted children away to nothing, but my father never believed it. Said Mrs. Wainwright would wail at the funerals that they weren't burying her real boys." Maria exchanged a significant look with Robert, whose skeptical expression had given way to disturbed fascination. "Thank you for telling us this," Maria said, pressing a silver dollar into the groundskeeper's weathered hand. "It helps confirm something we've been investigating." Back at the Palmer Hotel by mid-afternoon, the group reconvened to share their findings. Father Donnelly arrived first, carrying a leather portfolio filled with photocopied church records. Fleming was present at 32 christenings between 1870 and 1880, he reported grimly. In 17 of those cases the child died within a year, all from wealthy families, all diagnosed with failure to thrive or similar vague conditions. Dr. Wagner entered next, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from hours of research. The medical society was reluctant to discuss Fleming, but I found a former nurse who was more forthcoming after I mentioned the Wainwrights. She confirmed our suspicions. Fleming was part of a network that provided infants to wealthy couples unable to conceive. The children came from unwed mothers at St. Mary's, but demand exceeded supply. So he began stealing healthy infants and replacing them with sickly orphans destined to die, Francisco concluded as he joined them, setting down a stack of public records. City Hall was surprisingly helpful. I found death certificates for all 3 Wainwright boys, all signed by Fleming. But here's what's interesting. I cross-referenced with birth records from the same period. 3 male infants born to unwed mothers at St. Mary's disappeared from the orphanage records shortly before each Wainwright death. Maria shared the groundskeeper's story about the lightweight caskets, adding another piece to the horrifying puzzle they were assembling. "The question remains," Dr. Wagner said, pacing the hotel suite. "What happened to the real Wainwright boys? Were they actually placed with families unable to conceive, or was something more sinister at work?" Father Donnelly cleared his throat. "I believe I may have found a lead. Among Fleming's christening records, 3 families stood out. All wealthy, all childless for years, all suddenly blessed with sons within months of a Wainwright death. The Harringtons of Boston, the Caldwells of Philadelphia, and the Montgomerys right here in St. Louis." "The Montgomerys," Francisco repeated, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Richard Montgomery is one of the city's most prominent bankers. His son Walter is about to be appointed judge. Walter Montgomery would be the right age," Dr. Wagner calculated quickly. "Born, or rather acquired, in 1877, which would make him 31 now." Maria clutched Alejandro closer. "How do we approach this? We can't simply accuse Judge-elect Montgomery of not being who he thinks he is." "We need proof," Francisco agreed. "Something that would convince Elizabeth that we've found her sons, or at least one of them." Dr. Wagner rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The Wainwright boys would have identifying characteristics, birthmarks, perhaps. Elizabeth would know. But how do we ask her? Father Donnelly wondered. Return to the house? Maria shook her head firmly. Not with Alejandro. I won't risk it. After lengthy discussion, they formed a plan. Francisco and Dr. Wagner would make discreet inquiries about Walter Montgomery, seeking any physical characteristics that might match a Wainwright child. Father Donnelly would research the other two families from his church connections, and Maria, against everyone's better judgment, but with her characteristic determination, would return to the house alone to attempt communication with Elizabeth. I'll go at noon tomorrow, she insisted. Spirits are said to be less powerful in daylight, and I'll bring Mrs. Patterson for additional protection. Though Francisco protested, he eventually relented, knowing his wife's resolve was unshakable once set. The Mendoza house stood silent in the midday sun, its Victorian facade betraying nothing of the supernatural events that had transpired within its walls. Maria approached slowly, Mrs. Patterson at her side. The housekeeper had been reluctant to return, but had agreed out of loyalty to her employer, and after a substantial increase in her weekly wages. I still don't understand why we're doing this, Mrs. Mendoza, Mrs. Patterson said, as Maria unlocked the front door. If there's a ghost, shouldn't we be staying away? We made a promise, Maria replied simply, and I believe Elizabeth deserves peace just as my family does. They entered cautiously. The house felt different in daylight, ordinary, almost stubbornly mundane. No cold spots, no strange sounds, just the familiar creak of floorboards and tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Maria headed directly to the nursery, Mrs. Patterson following nervously. The room showed signs of their hasty departure 2 nights before. The shattered picture frame still on the floor, the blankets in the crib rumpled. Elizabeth, Maria called softly. I've come back as promised. We're looking for your sons. Nothing happened. The room remained still and silent. Perhaps she only appears at night, Mrs. Patterson suggested hopefully. Maria wasn't convinced. Elizabeth, she tried again, louder this time. We've found something about Dr. Fleming and what he did. A subtle change came over the room, not a dramatic drop in temperature or supernatural manifestation, but a sense of attention, as if the very air were listening. We believe your boys didn't die, Maria continued. Fleming took them, replaced them with sickly orphans, and placed your healthy sons with wealthy families who couldn't have children of their own. The rocking chair in the corner moved slightly, just an inch, but enough to make Mrs. Patterson gasp. We have names, Maria pressed on. The Harringtons, the Caldwells, and the Montgomerys. Do those names mean anything to you? A music box on the dresser opened by itself, the tinkling melody of Greensleeves filling the room. I think she's listening, Maria whispered to Mrs. Patterson, who had pressed herself against the wall in terror. Ask her what we need to know, and let's leave, the housekeeper pleaded. Maria nodded. Elizabeth, if these are your sons, we need to identify them. Did your boys have any birthmarks or distinguishing features? The temperature dropped noticeably, and a woman's voice, faint but distinct, whispered through the room. Thomas had a crescent moon on his shoulder. James had 6 toes on his left foot. Henry had mismatched eyes, one blue, one green. Mrs. Patterson fainted dead away, slumping to the floor. Maria, though frightened, stood her ground. Thank you, Elizabeth. We'll look for these signs. If we find your sons, will you release your hold on this house? Will you find peace? The response came not in words, but in a gentle touch on Maria's cheek, cold but not menacing, a mother's tender caress. When Mrs. Patterson revived, they left immediately, not wanting to push their luck. As they departed, Maria glanced back at the nursery window and saw, just for a moment, Elizabeth's face watching them, no longer twisted with anguish, but alert with cautious hope. Meanwhile, Francisco and Dr. Wagner had been making progress in their investigation of Walter Montgomery. Through business connections, Francisco arranged a meeting with the banker, ostensibly to discuss investment opportunities for his import business. Montgomery was a distinguished man of 31, with the confident bearing of someone born to privilege. He welcomed them into his office at the First National Bank of St. Louis, unaware of their true purpose. As they discussed potential investments, Dr. Wagner carefully observed the banker, looking for any sign of Elizabeth Wainwright in his features. There was something in the set of his jaw, perhaps, and the unusual green-gold color of his eyes. "I understand congratulations are in order," Francisco said smoothly. "Your son's appointment to the bench is quite an achievement." Montgomery beamed with paternal pride. "Walter has always been exceptional, a natural legal mind, even as a boy." "He must take after you," Dr. Wagner suggested. Montgomery's smile faltered slightly. "Actually, most say he favors his mother's side. The Prescott knows, you know." The conversation continued pleasantly until, as they were preparing to leave, Dr. Wagner deliberately knocked a glass of water onto Montgomery's desk. In the ensuing confusion of mopping up the spill, he managed to brush against Montgomery's shoulder, feeling for anything unusual beneath the banker's suit jacket. Back at the hotel, Dr. Wagner reported his findings. "I couldn't be certain, but I felt something on his left shoulder, a raised area of skin. It could be the crescent birthmark Elizabeth described." Father Donnelly had his own news. "I've received a response from my colleague in Boston. The Harrington heir, Charles, has a congenital condition, 6 toes on his left foot. He's quite sensitive about it, apparently." "Two confirmations," Francisco mused. "It seems Elizabeth was right all along." Maria recounted her experience at the house, including Elizabeth's detailed descriptions of her son's identifying features. "What now?" she asked. "Do we confront these men with the truth of their origins?" Dr. Wagner shook his head. "That would be cruel. They've lived their entire lives believing they are Harringtons and Montgomerys. Learning they were stolen as infants would devastate them. And for what purpose? The crime is 50 years old. Fleming is long dead." "But Elizabeth deserves justice," Maria insisted. "Perhaps justice doesn't mean disrupting innocent lives," Father Donnelly suggested gently. "These men aren't responsible for what happened to them as infants." Francisco had been quiet, considering. What if we find a way to let Elizabeth see that her sons lived good lives, that they grew up healthy and happy, even if not with her? "A séance," Dr. Wagner proposed unexpectedly. "We bring photographs, documents, evidence that her boys survived and thrived. Not to the men themselves, but to their mother's spirit." The plan took shape quickly. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, they gathered photographs and information about all 3 men who might be Elizabeth's stolen sons. Walter Montgomery, the potential Henry Wainwright, was the easiest. His appointment to the judiciary had been well documented in local papers. For Charles Harrington and Edward Caldwell, Father Donnelly's church connections proved invaluable, providing family photographs and biographical details. 3 days after fleeing their home, the Mendozas prepared to return, this time with purpose and preparation. The house on Lafayette Square seemed to be waiting for them as they approached at dusk, the last rays of sunlight glinting off its windows like watchful eyes. This time they came prepared, not just with evidence of Elizabeth's sons, but with protective measures suggested by both science and faith. Dr. Wagner had brought specialized equipment: a thermograph to record temperature fluctuations, a device to measure electromagnetic fields, and a more advanced camera than the one he'd used previously. Father Donnelly carried not just holy water and his crucifix, but also items blessed specifically for communication with restless spirits. Francisco and Maria brought Alejandro, believing his presence might be necessary to complete the connection that had begun with his christening. "Remember," Father Donnelly cautioned as they stood before the front door, "our purpose is not exorcism, but reconciliation. We're not banishing Elizabeth, but helping her find peace." They entered solemnly, feeling the house acknowledge their presence with subtle creaks and sighs. The air inside was noticeably cooler than the May evening outside, though not yet the bone-chilling cold they had experienced during Elizabeth's previous manifestations. "We should proceed to the nursery," Dr. Wagner suggested, his scientific instruments already registering anomalies. "That seems to be the focal point of her presence." The nursery had been cleaned since their last visit, the broken glass removed, the furniture straightened, presumably by Mrs. Patterson, who had insisted on preparing the house but had firmly declined to join them for the evening's activities. The room seemed almost ordinary in the warm glow of the electric lamps, though Dr. Wagner's thermograph showed temperature variations that defied natural explanation. They arranged themselves in a circle in the center of the room, Maria holding Alejandro, Francisco beside her, then Dr. Wagner with his instruments, and Father Donnelly completing the circle with his prayer book open before him. "Elizabeth Wainwright," the priest began formally, "we have returned as promised with news of your sons. We seek your presence not in fear, but in fellowship and compassion." For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the familiar signs of Elizabeth's manifestation began: the dropping temperature, the scent of lilacs, the slight movement of the rocking chair. But unlike before, these phenomena seemed controlled, almost gentle, less a haunting than a cautious greeting. "She's here," Maria whispered, feeling a now familiar prickle at the back of her neck. "Elizabeth, we've found them. Your boys. They lived." The apparition formed slowly, more defined than in previous appearances. Elizabeth stood before them, her mourning clothes sharp in detail, her face, though still marked by tragedy, more human than spectral. "Show me," she requested, her voice clearer than before, almost physical in the hushed room. Francisco carefully laid out the photographs and documents they had gathered. "This is Walter Montgomery, born Richard Montgomery, Jr., according to official records. But we believe he is your Henry. He's about to become a judge here in St. Louis." Elizabeth's ghost drifted closer, studying the photograph with desperate intensity. "His eyes," she whispered, "one blue, one green. My Henry's eyes." "And this," Maria continued, "is Charles Harrington of Boston, a successful architect who designed the new public library. Records show he was adopted in 1873, though the Harringtons claimed him as their natural son. The medical records we found confirm he has 6 toes on his left foot." "James," Elizabeth breathed, her form becoming more solid as recognition dawned. "My James always hid his foot. He thought it made him special, but I feared others would tease him." Dr. Wagner presented the final photograph. "Edward Caldwell of Philadelphia. A physician, ironically. We couldn't confirm the crescent birthmark directly, but his wife mentioned in a society column that her husband has a charming moon-shaped mark on his shoulder." "Thomas," Elizabeth's voice broke with emotion, "my firstborn. Fleming always admired him most, said he was perfect in every way." As Elizabeth gazed at the photographs of her sons, grown men now, successful and respected, her manifestation underwent a transformation. The grief that had defined her spectral existence began to lift, the anguish in her eyes replaced by something like wonder. "They lived," she repeated, as if trying to convince herself. "Not just lived, thrived. My boys became men. Good men," Father Donnelly affirmed. "Men who have contributed to society, who have families of their own now. Your grandchildren live throughout the country." Elizabeth's ghost reached out as if to touch the photographs, her translucent fingers passing through them. "I searched for so long," she said softly, "screamed the truth until they locked me away. Edward wouldn't believe me, said I was mad with grief." "You weren't mad," Maria assured her, bouncing Alejandro gently in her arms. "You were right all along. Fleming stole your children and replaced them with dying orphans. It was cruel beyond measure." "But why?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small. "Why my boys?" Dr. Wagner cleared his throat. "Money, most likely. The families who received your sons were wealthy and desperate for heirs. Fleming probably received substantial payments for providing them with healthy infants from good stock, as they would have phrased it. Elizabeth's form flickered with renewed anger. And my boys never knew? Never suspected they weren't born to those families? Probably not, Francisco said gently. They were too young to remember you when they were taken, and their adoptive families, however wrong their actions, seem to have loved them and raised them well. Elizabeth drifted toward the window, looking out at the city now illuminated by electric lights, a St. Louis far different from the one she had known in life. I died believing my children were dead, she said, more to herself than to them. I couldn't bear it, couldn't live in a world so cruel where a mother's instincts were dismissed as hysteria. Your death was a tragedy, Father Donnelly said solemnly, but your spirit remained, seeking justice, and now perhaps you can find peace knowing your son survived and prospered. Elizabeth turned back to them, her form more translucent now, as if the confirmation of her son's fates was already loosening her ties to the physical world. The deaths, she said suddenly, her gaze falling on Alejandro. After the christenings. I never meant. I just needed someone to see the pattern, to question as I had questioned. We understand, Maria said, instinctively shielding Alejandro. But no more deaths need to follow christenings in this house. The truth is known now. Fleming's crimes have been exposed, even if only to us. Elizabeth nodded slowly. The pattern can end, she agreed. But what of my boys? Will they ever know the truth of who they are, of who I was to them? The question hung in the air, complicated and painful. To tell these men the truth would upend their identities, potentially causing more harm than healing. Perhaps not the full truth, Francisco suggested carefully, but we could find ways to connect them to their heritage, to you, without destroying the lives they've built. Dr. Wagner nodded. I have colleagues who could discreetly reach out to them, perhaps as genealogists researching the Wainwright family, share stories of their biological mother's courage and love, without revealing the criminal circumstances of their adoption. And the Church has ways of honoring ancestors, Father Donnelly added. Masses could be said for you, Elizabeth, with your sons invited as distant relations, a way for them to connect with you spiritually, if not consciously. Elizabeth seemed to consider these possibilities, her spectral features softening. They would know something of me then, not everything, but something. They would, Maria promised. We will make sure of it. As they spoke, the paranormal phenomena in the room began to subside. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and Elizabeth's apparition became increasingly transparent, as if the burden that had kept her bound to the house was lifting. I'm tired, she said finally, her voice fading. So tired of anger and grief. I want to rest now. You can rest, Father Donnelly assured her, opening his prayer book. Your children lived, Elizabeth. They were loved, and they became good men who would make any mother proud. Elizabeth's ghost smiled, a real smile, perhaps the first since her death decades ago. Thank you, she whispered, looking at each of them in turn before her gaze settled on Alejandro. Keep him safe. Love him enough for all the mothers who couldn't. With those words, her form dissolved completely, not in the violent dispersion of an exorcism, but in the gentle release of a spirit finally at peace. The lilac scent lingered briefly, then was gone. Dr. Wagner's instruments recorded the change, the room's temperature returning to normal, the electromagnetic readings stabilizing. I believe she's moved on, he said quietly, scientific detachment failing to mask his emotion. Father Donnelly closed his prayer book. May she rest in peace, and may her sons live long and prosper, even in ignorance of their true origins. Francisco took Maria's hand. Is it over? Can we come home? Maria looked around the nursery. Just a room now, nothing more. Yes, she said with certainty. We can come home. Elizabeth has found her peace, and perhaps we can finally find ours. Life at the Mendoza house gradually returned to normal in the weeks following their confrontation with Elizabeth Wainwright's spirit. The paranormal activity ceased entirely. No cold spots, no mysterious sounds, no ghostly apparitions. It was as if Elizabeth, having received confirmation that her sons had lived good lives, had finally found the peace that had eluded her in life and for decades after death. But while the haunting had ended, its effects lingered in the lives of those who had experienced it. Maria found herself thinking often of Elizabeth, another mother separated from her children, though in circumstances far more tragic than Maria could imagine. She kept the photographs of Elizabeth's grown sons in a small album, a tangible reminder of promises made to a desperate spirit. Francisco, whose skepticism had been thoroughly shattered by the events, became quietly interested in the paranormal. His business associates noticed his new habit of asking about the histories of buildings before considering investments, particularly any patterns of tragedy or unexplained occurrences. Dr. Wagner had perhaps been most profoundly affected. The physician, who had prided himself on scientific rationalism, now found himself straddling two worlds, the empirical one of medical science and the mysterious realm of phenomena that defied conventional explanation. He continued his medical practice, but also began documenting cases of what he carefully termed psychological imprints on physical environments, avoiding the more sensationalistic term, hauntings. Father Donnelly, alone among them, seemed unsurprised by the entire affair. "The Church has always acknowledged the thin veil between worlds," he explained when Francisco questioned him. "We may not advertise it, but priests have been dealing with restless spirits as long as we've been ministering to the living." True to their word, they had begun the delicate process of connecting Elizabeth's sons with their heritage, without revealing the criminal circumstances of their origins. Dr. Wagner had colleagues in Boston and Philadelphia make discreet inquiries about the Harrington and Caldwell families, ostensibly for a medical history project tracking certain genetic traits. In St. Louis, Francisco took a more direct approach with Walter Montgomery, now Judge Montgomery, following his appointment to the bench. Under the guise of a historical society documenting prominent St. Louis families, he arranged to interview the judge about his ancestors. "It's curious," Montgomery remarked during their conversation in his chambers. "I've always felt drawn to Lafayette Square, though my family never lived there. Sometimes I drive past those old Victorians and feel something. Nostalgia, perhaps, though for what, I couldn't say." Francisco had nodded, carefully steering the conversation to include mentions of the Wainwright family, prominent residents of the area in the 1870s, without revealing any connection. He left a detailed family history with the judge, one that included photographs of Elizabeth and her husband Edward. "You know," Montgomery said, studying Elizabeth's photograph with unexpected intensity, "she reminds me of someone. My mother, perhaps, though that's impossible. The Prescotts and Wainwrights never intermarried, to my knowledge." "Resemblances can be strange that way," Francisco had replied neutrally. "Something in the eyes, perhaps." In June, Father Donnelly arranged a memorial mass for Elizabeth Wainwright, marking the anniversary of her death. To Maria's surprise, Judge Montgomery attended, explaining that he had been inexplicably moved by the Historical Society materials Francisco had provided. "I've been researching the Wainwrights," he confided to Maria after the service. "Such a tragic story. 3 sons lost in infancy, then Elizabeth's suicide. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I never had children of my own. Some families seem marked by tragedy, don't they?" Maria had merely nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The judge would never know that he was, in fact, Elizabeth's surviving son, that the tragedy he spoke of was partly his own story. But in his presence at the memorial, in his inexplicable interest in a family not his own, perhaps some part of him recognized the connection that logic and circumstance denied. By midsummer, the Mendoza house was filled with light and laughter again. Miguel, Gabriel, and Raphael, initially reluctant to return after their encounter with the lady upstairs, gradually forgot their fears as childhood resilience took over. Alejandro thrived, showing no ill effects from his role as the catalyst in Elizabeth's final attempts to communicate. Mrs. Patterson returned to her duties, though she flatly refused to enter the nursery alone and crossed herself whenever she passed the room. "Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there," she would mutter, ignoring Dr. Wagner's assurances that his instruments detected no remaining paranormal activity. On the anniversary of Alejandro's christening, the event that had brought Elizabeth's desperate pattern to light, Maria found herself alone in the nursery, putting her youngest son down for his afternoon nap. The room was peaceful, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, the rocking chair still except for the gentle motion Maria herself created. As she laid Alejandro in his crib, a familiar scent drifted through the room. Lilacs, though none were in bloom in their garden this late in the season. Instead of fear, Maria felt a strange comfort in the gentle reminder of Elizabeth's presence. "We kept our promise," she said softly to the empty room. "Your sons know something of you now, even if they don't understand the full truth. They light candles for you, Elizabeth. They visit your grave. In some small way, you're a mother to them again." The scent intensified briefly, then faded away entirely. Maria smiled, understanding the message in this final visitation. Not a haunting, but a farewell, and perhaps in its way a thank you. Outside, the city of St. Louis continued its relentless march into the 20th century. Automobiles increasingly replaced horse-drawn carriages on the streets, electric lights pushed back the darkness, and modern medicine made infant mortality increasingly rare. The world that had allowed Dr. Fleming's crimes to go undetected was disappearing, replaced by one with different challenges but also greater protections for mothers and their children. As Maria left the nursery, she glanced back one last time. For a moment, just the briefest instant, she thought she saw Elizabeth standing by the crib, not the tortured spirit they had first encountered, but a mother at peace, watching over a child not her own, with the universal love that transcends blood and time. Then the image was gone, leaving only sunlight and shadows and the soft breathing of Alejandro in his peaceful sleep. Late September 1908. The leaves in Lafayette Square had begun their transformation, painting the park in shades of amber and crimson. The Mendoza house, once the site of supernatural terror, had settled into tranquility as summer gave way to autumn. Francisco sat in his study, reviewing correspondence from his Boston and Philadelphia contacts. The process of connecting Elizabeth's sons with their heritage had progressed slowly but steadily over the months. Charles Harrington, the architect with 6 toes, had become fascinated with the Wainwright family history provided to him, and had even commissioned a memorial bench in Boston Common dedicated to the lost children of St. Louis. Edward Caldwell, the physician, had been more reserved in his response, but had made a substantial anonymous donation to St. Mary's Orphanage for the establishment of a medical clinic in the name of Elizabeth Wainwright. "They may never know the truth," Francisco murmured to himself, "but some part of them recognizes the connection." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Miguel, now 9 years old, clutching a newspaper. "Papa," he said hesitantly, "there's something in the paper about Judge Montgomery." Francisco took the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from his son, his heart sinking as he read the headline, "Distinguished Judge Collapses in Courtroom." The article detailed how Walter Montgomery had suffered what appeared to be a stroke while presiding over a case and was now in critical condition at Mercy Hospital. "Thank you, Miguel," Francisco said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Run along now and help your mother with the younger boys." When the child had gone, Francisco immediately telephoned Dr. Wagner, who promised to make inquiries at the hospital. By evening, they had confirmation. Judge Montgomery was not expected to survive the night. "There's something else," Dr. Wagner said, when he arrived at the Mendoza house later that evening. Before he lost consciousness, Montgomery was reportedly delirious, talking about a woman named Elizabeth who was calling to him. The nurse who told me this thought he was referring to his wife. But his wife's name is Harriet, Francisco interrupted, having learned this during his research. Exactly, Dr. Wagner nodded gravely. And there's more. The judge kept insisting that his real name was Henry. Maria gasped. Henry Wainwright, Elizabeth's youngest son. It seems some part of him remembered after all, Father Donnelly mused. He had joined them after receiving Francisco's urgent message. The veil between life and death can thin at such moments, allowing buried truths to surface. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. Had their efforts to connect Montgomery with his true heritage somehow triggered these memories? Or was Elizabeth herself, from whatever realm she now inhabited, reaching out to her son in his final hours? I need to go to him, Maria said suddenly, rising from her chair. He shouldn't die alone, with only strangers to hear his true name. Francisco started to object, then reconsidered. You're right. He deserves that much. Dr. Wagner used his professional credentials to gain them access to Montgomery's hospital room late that night. The judge lay pale and still, his breathing labored, attended by a single nurse who withdrew discreetly when Dr. Wagner explained they were family friends. Maria approached the bed hesitantly, taking Montgomery's limp hand in hers. Henry, she whispered, using his true name for the first time. Henry Wainwright. Your mother is waiting for you. Elizabeth. She's been waiting for so long. Montgomery's eyelids fluttered, though he didn't fully regain consciousness. A slight pressure on Maria's hand suggested he had heard and understood. She never stopped looking for you, Maria continued, tears filling her eyes. She never stopped loving you. And now, after all these years, you can be together again. A change came over the judge's face. A relaxation, a release of tension he had perhaps carried unknowingly his entire life. His breathing became more regular, though still weak. Francisco stepped forward, placing a photograph of Elizabeth Wainwright in Montgomery's other hand. Your mother, he said simply. Whether by coincidence or something more mysterious, Montgomery's eyes opened at that moment. They were indeed mismatched, one blue, one green, just as Elizabeth had described. He looked at the photograph with an expression of profound recognition. Mother, he whispered so faintly they could barely hear, I've been looking for you too. Those were his last words. Judge Walter Montgomery, born Henry Wainwright, died peacefully minutes later, the photograph of Elizabeth still clutched in his hand. The funeral was held 3 days later at Bellefontaine Cemetery. At Francisco's suggestion, the judge was buried not in the Montgomery family plot, but near the Wainwright obelisk, though without any indication of the true connection. It was a well-attended service, with city officials and legal colleagues paying their respects to a man known for his integrity and wisdom on the bench. As the mourners dispersed, Maria lingered by the fresh grave, wondering if Elizabeth somehow knew that her youngest son now rested near her. The day was unusually warm for late September, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the last summer roses from nearby plots. Mrs. Mendoza. She turned to see an elderly woman leaning heavily on a cane, her face vaguely familiar, though Maria couldn't immediately place her. Yes? You don't remember me, but I was nurse to Judge Montgomery's mother, Mrs. Prescott, in her final years. The old woman studied Maria with shrewd eyes. I overheard you at the hospital, calling him Henry Wainwright. Maria felt a chill despite the warm day. I'm afraid you must be mistaken. No mistake, the nurse interrupted. I've kept silent for 50 years, but with the judge gone now. She glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Mrs. Prescott confessed everything to me on her deathbed. How they paid Dr. Fleming an obscene amount of money for a healthy baby. How they never questioned where he came from. Maria didn't know how to respond. This confirmation of Elizabeth's claims, after all this time, seemed almost anticlimactic. She was consumed by guilt in her final years. the nurse continued, said she'd dream of a woman in mourning clothes standing over her bed, watching her with accusing eyes. I always assumed it was her conscience, but perhaps it was more than that, Maria finished softly. The old nurse nodded. The judge was a good man, better than the ones who bought him. I like to think that means something. As the nurse hobbled away, Maria felt a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun with Alejandro's christening nearly a year ago was closing. Elizabeth had found her sons, one in life, perhaps all three now in death, and the pattern of tragedy that had followed the Mendoza family had been broken. That night, after the children were asleep, Maria, Francisco, Dr. Wagner, and Father Donnelly gathered in the parlor of the Mendoza home. It felt like an epilogue, the final meeting of conspirators who had glimpsed truths few others would ever comprehend. "I've been offered a position at Johns Hopkins," Dr. Wagner announced, researching what they're calling psychological imprints on physical environments. It seems our experience with Elizabeth has opened new doors in my career. And I've been asked to document cases of similar phenomena for the diocesan archives, Father Donnelly added. The Church has always known such things exist, but rarely discusses them publicly. Francisco raised his glass in a toast. To Elizabeth Wainwright, may she and her sons find in death the peace that was denied them in life. And to the truth, Maria added quietly. However painful, however long buried, it finds its way to light eventually. As they drank to these sentiments, a familiar scent drifted through the room. Lilacs, faint but unmistakable. Not a haunting now, but a blessing. A mother's gratitude, perhaps, for promises kept and justice, however imperfect, finally served. Outside, autumn leaves rustled in the Lafayette Square gardens. Inside, the Mendoza home stood peaceful at last, its dark chapter closed, its future unburdened by the tragedies of the past. And somewhere beyond the veil that separates worlds, they liked to think that Elizabeth Wainwright had finally gathered her sons, Thomas, James, and Henry, in the embrace that had been denied them for so many years.